Okay, chapter 6, bones and bone tissue. So bone functions. You're going to have the shape of a bone. The shape is going to give the body its structure. Support. Obviously the bones of the legs, pelvis, and spinal column support the body and hold it upright. Protection. Bones protect delicate internal organs. Your ribs are going to protect your heart and your lungs. Movement, right? Movement of the arms and legs, as well as the ability to breathe, result from the interaction between muscles and bones. Obviously, when a muscle contracts, then a bone moves. That's what we want. So bones also help with electrolyte balance. Bones store and release minerals like calcium and phosphorus. Blood production happens as a result of bones. That happens in the red bone marrow. You also have acid and base balance. Bone absorbs and releases alkaline salts to help maintain a stable pH. So here's the classifications of bones. We're going to have long bones here. We're going to have flat bones like up here on the skull. We're going to have short bones down here like in your foot, tarsal bone, and irregular bones like your vertebra. Long bones work as levers to move limbs. So the femur of the thigh or the humerus of the arm. You're going to have a short bone. They are about as broad as they are long, and they tend to be shaped like cubes. So your carpal bones of the wrist and tarsal bones of the ankle are example of short bones. Flat bones are thin, flat, and often curved, and these protect organs. They provide a surface area for points of muscle attachment. Irregular bones are going to be clustered in groups, and they're in various shapes and sizes, like the ones in your wrists. Excuse me, not in your wrist, your vertebrae, and also your facial bones. So all the bones in your face are irregular. All the bones in your spine are vertebrae. These are irregular bones. Sesamoid bones are bones that are actually entrapped within muscle or tendon. So a small bone embedded in a tendon would be your kneecap. Now you have parts of a long bone, and parts of the long bone are going to be your diaphysis, which is the long shaft part. You're going to have the epiphysis, which is the end portion. And then you're going to have on the inside of the diaphysis, the medullary cavity, bone marrow, and then these things called the osteums. End osteum is the layer on the inside, and then periosteum is the layer on the outside. The periosteum is like saran wrap. It basically just wraps around the bone, and this is the part of the bone that muscles will attach into. It also carries blood vessels. It carries nervous tissue. It is kind of the lifeline for the underlying bone. Okay, so let's talk about the different parts of the long bone. The diaphysis, this is made out of compact bone. So we talked about the diaphysis being the long shaft-like portion. This is going to give the bone its strength, and it's a hollow cylinder. On the ends of the long bones, you're going to have what's called articular cartilage, and this basically covers the epiphysis. And this eases the movement of the bone within a joint. So if you think about it, you have cartilage that covers the ends of your bones, and as your femur moves with your tibia, right, your upper thigh moves with your lower leg, those bones will articulate and touch each other, and you want to have nice cartilage on the ends of the bones as they touch to absorb a lot of the shock. If we go back and look at the picture here, right here you can see the articular cartilage here and here as well as down here. And that's important it acts as a pillow between the two bones that meet. So the medullary cavity is the central long hollow portion where the red bone marrow will lie. So this fills the medullary cavity in kids. And then in adults, it turns to yellow marrow. And in kids are growing a lot faster than adults are. So kids need more red blood cells. So red bone marrow makes red blood cells in children because they are growing and need a lot more red blood cells. If in fact you have a lot of blood loss later on in life, or for some reason you need to produce more red blood cells, maybe you move to a higher altitude, then you will have yellow marrow turn back to red bone marrow temporarily to make more red blood cells. We'll talk about that more later. The endosteum is an epithelial membrane that lines the medullary cavity. So the periosteum, this is dense fibrous membrane and it covers the bone. Some of the fibers of the periosteum will penetrate the bone. Other fibers weave together with the fibers of tendons to ensure a strong connection between muscle and bone. We talked about that. And then these also contain bone-forming cells and blood vessels, and it's crucial for bone survival. So the epiphyseal plate is a layer of cartilage separating the epiphysis from the diaphysis at the ends of the long bone in growing kids. So this is also known as your growth plate. So the layer of cartilage separating the epiphysis, or the end of the bone, from the diaphysis and the long central part of the bone at the end of the long bone in growing kids. So when the growth stops, it's replaced with an epiphyseal line. Let's see if we can see an example of that. So right here, here's the epiphysis, this is the diaphysis, and that line that you can see that my cursor is going over is the growth plate. And what happens is when children are growing, this is cartilaginous, and it allows for growth in this direction as well as this direction, and thus the bone will elongate. When this starts to calcify over, then the growth plate is considered closed and children cannot grow anymore. So, which of the following is not one of the functions of the bone? Electrolyte balance, blood production, acid-base balance, or regulation of blood glucose? The answer is D, regulation of blood glucose. It does not play a role. All right, bone tissue. Bone is osseous tissue. It's a type of connective tissue. Bone cells are known as osteoblasts, osteoclasts, and osteocytes. So osteoblasts build bone. Osteoclasts consume bone. That's how I remember those. Osteocytes are a mature osteoblast that has built up a lot of bone, and in fact it has basically walled itself into bone. It has encased itself in bone. So therefore, these are mature osteoblasts embedded in hardened bone matrix. Basically, it's a brick mason that has built himself into a wall. So this helps regulate calcium and phosphorus in your blood levels. That's what the osteocyte does. I want you to really know the different kinds of bone cells. So when bone experiences an increase in load, osteocytes stimulate the creation of new bone. What that basically means is, as you work your bones, either go running or you lift weights, you put stress on your bones and your bones will start to remodel. And remodeling is very important. You want to have old bone be broken down and new bone be made. Okay, so there's different kinds of bone. You have contact bone and spongy bone. Compact bone forms the shafts of long bones and the surfaces of other bones. Spongy or cancellous bone is found in the end of long bones and in the middle of other bones. It's always surrounded by compact bone. So let's see if we can see an example here. Here is a quarter of a piece of bone. Think of a long bone like your femur. So spongy or cancellous bone consists of a lattice work of bone called trabeculae in here, and this is slightly movable. Trabeculae are arranged in a way to offer maximum strength. So the stress on the bone of the trabeculae will realign to compensate. So in cavities between the trabeculae, these are filled with bone marrow. So think of a sponge. This is basically what that does. And then in order to maintain strength for when you have compression, then we have this stuff out here called compact bone, and that's on the side. So what it does is that this enables the bone to be strong and bendable, but not break. All right, so compact bone is made up of a lot of different moving parts here. Well, I shouldn't say moving parts, nothing's moving, but you have a Haversian canal, you have lamella, lacuna, canaliculi, Volkmann's canal. I'm not going to be super uptight that you guys know all of this stuff. So layers of the matrix are arranged in concentric rings called lamella around a central canal called the Haversian or osteonic canal. And the basic structural unit is called an osteon. Blood vessels and nerves run the length of the bone through the center of the canal, and then tiny gaps between the rings of lamella called lacunae contain the osteocytes. So canaliculi connect the lamella to each other, and then transverse passageways called Volkmann's canals connect the Haversian canals. These transport blood and nutrients from the bone's exterior to the osteocytes locked inside. Keep in mind, this bone is very, 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 very dense, and so not a whole lot of blood vessels pass through this. And so we have to have these microscopic structural anomalies called canaliculi and Volkmann's canals that help to create a method for bone to get its nutrients. Okay, so the basic structural unit of bone is an osteon. Lacuna are the gaps between the rings of lamella. Canaliculi are the microscopic passageways that connect the lamella, and an osteocyte is a bone cell. Okay, let's talk a little bit about bone marrow. Soft tissue filling the medullary cavity of long bones, and these are also in the spaces of spongy bone. So red bone marrow is in children. It's mostly red bone marrow, and also in adults. In adults don't have as much as children because adults don't need to replace the red blood cells as often or to create more red blood cells like kids do. In adults, we do have red blood cell or red marrow in the ribs, the sternum, the vertebrae, the skull, pelvis, and upper parts of the humerus and the femur. Now we have yellow marrow, which is saturated with fat, and this is in all other bones. And this stuff can change into red marrow if you have severe blood loss or anemia, like we talked about earlier. Now, when bones develop, they develop in two different ways. One can be an intramembranous ossification, and that occurs in the bones of the skull and the face, and these start out as very soft connective tissue. Or you can have what's called endochondral ossification, and most bones will evolve from the cartilage, and these begin with long bones. So what happens when you make a long bone? You have cartilage, and essentially you have that cartilage start to stretch out north and south, and it fills in the middle. And then all of a sudden you start to get those cartilaginous plates up here, and those are your growth plates. And so it turns into a long bone. That's endochondral. So bone lengthening occurs at the epiphyseal plate for a fixed period. It will stop when the chondrocytes, or cells that produce cartilage, are no longer made. That happens around 16 to 25. And the epiphyseal line is the line of spongy bone within the epiphysis. So bone widening will continue throughout the lifespan. So we have lengthening occurs early on and stops at a certain period. Bone widening continues throughout the lifespan. So osteoblasts in the periosteum, remember the periosteum? So those osteoblasts will lay down new layers of bone around the outside of the bone. Then you'll have osteoclasts on the inside of the bone dissolving the bone tissue, so it will slowly widen the marrow cavity. Bone growth. A fetus's first skeleton is composed primarily of, what do you think? Cartilage. Epithelial tissue is not involved in the formation of bone. Osseous tissue is obviously bone. So while parts of the skull begin as fibrous connective tissue, most of it evolves from cartilage. So let's talk about bone growth and maintenance. Obviously, your heredity plays a role. You can have inherited genes that will determine your maximum height potential. Malnourished kids will grow slowly, and that will limit their height potential. They've done studies in North Korea, and they've shown that North Koreans are much shorter than their South Korean counterparts, and that's due to lack of nutrition. Hormones also contribute to proper growth, and then, of course, exercise is important because bone destruction will it says here bone destruction will outpace bone creation. Well, what happens is as you destroy your bone, you then build it back up. And so that's the important thing of exercise, is you want to have destruction and then creation. Okay, so if you have a break in a fracture, or a break in a bone, this is called a fracture. A closed reduction means that you don't have to open somebody up to fix it. You can just put the two bones together and put them in a cast, and they're good to go. Open reduction means that we have to open somebody up, and surgery is necessary. So you put in screws, pins, plates, etc. to stabilize the bone. That's an open reduction. Simple fracture is where the bone remains aligned with intact tissues.